All right, welcome to your own personalized deep dive. This time, we're going way deeper than your typical World War I history lesson.
Yeah.
You want to get into those big impacts, the kind of stuff textbooks skip over.
Right.
You even threw in some declassified intelligence documents. Ooh, this is getting juicy.
Yeah.
I'm excited to dig into all this with you.
Well, it's really interesting, the mix you've got here. You've got military history and technology, sure, but also you've included economics and even the psychological effects of the war.
Yeah.
You're really going for a complete picture of this conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, way beyond battles and dates,
And you're in for a treat.
Yeah.
One thing that often gets overlooked is how World War I, it wasn't inevitable.
Right.
This was a whole series of choices and decisions that, looking back, it's almost unbelievable.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I mean, we all know about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but was that really the only reason for the war?
That assassination, it was a catalyst.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Okay.
But to see it as like the only spark, that's a dangerous oversimplification. We have to really understand why these nations chose to go to war. And to do that, we have to look at the economic tensions that were just simmering under the surface.
Okay, yeah. I've actually got a source here. The economic factors that shaped the First World War. And it looks like it dives right into that.
Excellent choice. That source highlights the intense economic rivalries of the early 20th century. For example, the Anglo-German naval race. This wasn't just about building bigger battleships. It was really a very real sign of this deeper economic and imperial competition.
Okay.
Great Britain, with its huge empire, relied on its navy for trade, for security. And Germany, trying to grow its own global influence, saw a powerful navy as the key to challenging British dominance.
So this naval race, it was basically them flexing their economic muscles.
Exactly. Each new dreadnought launched was a statement. Like they were saying, look, we have the factories, we have the resources, the technology, we can compete.
Wow.
But this competition wasn't just between Britain and Germany. The source actually provides these two really insightful tables. Table 1 shows the resource disparities between the two main alliances when the war started.
Okay.
The Allies, especially Great Britain and its empire, they had a big advantage in terms of population, territory, and potential wealth. They were, in a lot of ways, better prepared for a long fight.
But wasn't Germany like a major industrial power back then? I always hear about how advanced their manufacturing was.
Oh, absolutely. Germany had an incredibly concentrated and efficient industrial base, especially in the Rhineland. They were forced to be reckoned with, for sure. But Table 2 shows us this crucial turning point. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917,
Oh, okay.
the balance of resources shifted massively.
So even though the U.S. joined late, their economic power, it was like a game changer.
Precisely. Their entry basically doubled the Allies' economic output. So now they could outproduce Germany in key areas like artillery shells, tanks. This economic advantage, it was a huge factor in the eventual Allied victory. You know, it's a powerful reminder that wars aren't won just on battlefields.
Right.
They're won in factories, in shipyards.
Wow, that really puts things in perspective. I'm starting to see how economics played a way bigger role than I thought.
And you've even included a source here on espionage and sabotage.
Yes.
These elements add a whole other layer to the story of how World War I unfolded.
I've got this document labeled Intel WWY.
Okay.
And it talks about German sabotage efforts in the U.S. even before America officially joined the war.
That's crucial. It's a detail you don't often see in those history books. German agents, they were already operating on U.S. soil,
Wow.
targeting industries that were supplying the Allies. They were disrupting production, planting bombs, even trying to stir up trouble with workers.
They were blowing things up in America. That's crazy.
These actions highlight two key points.
Right.
First, they show just how vulnerable a nation is when it's not ready for attacks like that. The U.S. at that time didn't have a centralized intelligence organization,
Wow.
and they were really caught off guard.
Wow.
Second, these events, they added to the bad blood between Germany and the U.S. It pushed America closer and closer to joining the Allied side.
So these seemingly isolated acts of sabotage actually had a huge impact on the whole war.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And they had a lasting impact on intelligence gathering, too.
Yeah.
The MI5 and World War I source shows how British intelligence, unlike the U.S., was already catching German spies and disrupting their networks.
Okay.
The war basically forced nations to realize that they needed strong intelligence, for both attack and defense.
So World War I kind of changed the espionage game forever.
It was a real turning point.
Yeah.
And it raises a fascinating question. Did this increased focus on security actually make it harder to get good intelligence later in the war?
Mm.
A more secure system might also be harder to crack,
Yeah.
making it tougher for spies to get in and gather information.
That's a great point. Yeah, I'm already seeing how all these things that seem separate are actually connected in ways I hadn't thought about.
And we've only just scratched the surface. This conflict was a whirlwind.
Yeah.
Political maneuvering, technological innovation, just human drama, all of it.
Speaking of technology, I'm especially interested in the weapons and tactics of the war.
Okay.
You mentioned something about a mismatch between the two. Can you talk about that?
Yes. World War I was this brutal testing ground for military innovation, where old ways of fighting clashed head-on with these devastating new weapons.
Yeah, we were talking about World War I being this brutal clash between like outdated tactics and these terrifying new weapons.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine just the sheer scale of the carnage, you know?
The source, WWI, technology, and the weapons of war,
Oh.
it really brings that home. Take, for example, the machine gun.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the firepower was just unheard of, capable of wiping out entire advancing units.
Wow.
But, many military leaders, they were stuck in the old ways of thinking. They still believed in these mass infantry charges.
So they were basically sending waves of soldiers against these incredibly powerful machine guns.
But the Battle of the Somme in 1916, that's a chilling example. The British Army, they suffered over 57,000 casualties just on the first day.
Oh my gosh.
Many of them mowed down by German machine guns. It was just this horrifying demonstration of how technology had completely outpaced tactical thinking.
It's almost unfathomable. And it wasn't just machine guns, right?
No.
The source also mentions the impact of artillery.
Artillery in World War I, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. I mean, the sheer volume of shells fired, it just transformed the landscape. Just this desolate wasteland of craters and mud.
Yeah.
The source, shell shock after the First World War. It describes the psychological trauma that soldiers went through because of this constant bombardment. The deafening noise, the fear of sudden death, the sight of your comrades being blown apart, it all took a terrible toll.
And that source also mentions shell shock, a term we now kind of associate with PTSD.
Right.
It wasn't just about physical wounds.
No, not at all. Shell shock, it encompassed this whole spectrum of psychological trauma. One soldier, he described it as like 1,000 tiny cuts to the soul.
Wow.
They weren't just dealing with the immediate horrors of battle. It was also the long-term effects, the prolonged exposure to this violence and death.
Right, right.
And what's particularly tragic is that shell shock was often misunderstood,
Yeah.
stigmatized.
Yeah.
Many soldiers suffered in silence, afraid to ask for help because they didn't want to be labeled as cowards.
It makes you wonder how many soldiers just continued to suffer, long after the war ended, carrying those invisible wounds.
The psychological impact of World War I is something that historians are still trying to understand, even today. It's a reminder that the true cost of war, it goes way beyond the numbers,
Right.
the casualties. It also includes the shattered minds, the broken spirits of those who survived.
And the innovations, they weren't limited to land warfare, right?
Right.
You also flag some sources about advancements in aerial warfare.
At the start of the war, airplanes were mostly used for reconnaissance, just observing enemy positions. But as the conflict went on, they quickly evolved into weapons platforms.
So like dogfights and bombing raids.
Exactly. And it wasn't just airplanes. The Germans even used this super long-range artillery to shell Paris from like almost 80 miles away.
Wow.
This forced the Allies to develop countermeasures, things like anti-aircraft guns.
So it sounds like it was this constant game of one-upmanship, with each side trying to outdo the other in technology.
The technological arms race, driven by this desperate need to gain any advantage they could over the enemy. There's this one particularly striking anecdote. Allied pilots using these incendiary bullets to ignite German observation balloons.
Oh, wow.
Imagine seeing those fighter balls erupting in the sky. Terrifying.
Yeah.
But also, in a strange way, it's a testament to human ingenuity.
You mentioned earlier some ethical questions surrounding, the role of technology in warfare. It feels like World War I really brought those questions to the forefront.
Absolutely. These new technologies, they weren't just abstract concepts. They were being used to kill people on an industrial scale.
Right.
The sheer brutality of World War I,
Yeah.
it forced the world to really confront this uncomfortable reality.
Yeah.
How technology could just amplify the horrors of war.
Okay, so we've talked about the devastating weapons, the psychological trauma, the relentless technological innovation. But World War I also had a profound impact on societies far from the front lines, didn't it?
Yeah, that's an essential part of the war's legacy.
Hmm.
It reshaped social structures,
Yeah.
challenged gender roles, and forced nations to really deal with the economic fallout of such a massive conflict.
One thing that really struck me in the sources was how the war impacted women.
Hmm.
You know, with so many men off fighting, women had to step up, fill roles that they were never allowed to before.
It was a huge turning point for women's rights.
Yeah.
Faced with these labor shortages, countries had no choice but to rely on women to keep their economies running.
Yeah.
Women took on jobs in factories, in shipyards, transportation. They even served as nurses and ambulance drivers close to the front.
So the war, in a way, kind of shattered those old ideas about women being too delicate or incapable of working in these traditionally male-dominated fields.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And this wartime experience, it had a huge impact on the women's suffrage movement.
Mm.
Having proven their competence, their resilience, women demanded the right to vote, the right to participate fully in the political process.
It's amazing how something as horrific as a world war could actually lead to such positive social change.
It really highlights the complex, often contradictory nature of historical events.
Mm.
Progress and suffering,
Mm.
they can sometimes be intertwined.
You mentioned that the war also spurred advances in medicine.
Yes.
That seems kind of counterintuitive given all the death and destruction.
It's another example of how war, tragically, can speed up innovation.
Right.
The urgent need to treat battlefield injuries, it led to breakthroughs in surgery, wound care, even the development of new antibiotics.
Yeah, I've got the source, technology and equipment developed during World War I, right here.
Okay.
It specifically mentions improvements in ambulances, antiseptics, and specialized anesthetics.
These advancements, they were born out of necessity, but they had this lasting impact on healthcare. The techniques and technologies developed during World War I, they would go on to save countless lives in the decades that followed, both on and off the battlefield.
Right.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, human ingenuity can still shine through.
That's a really powerful point. It seems like every aspect of life was touched by this war, even just the way people thought about the world. It must have been forever changed.
Absolutely. The psychological and emotional legacy of World War I is profound.
Yeah.
The scale of the violence, the sense of disillusionment, the loss of innocence, it all contributed to a shift in cultural attitudes and values.
One source, the First World War and the Legacy of Shell Shock, it talks about this feeling of a lost generation. Those who survived the war, they came back profoundly changed,
Yes.
unable to relate to the world they left behind.
Exactly. They had seen the fragility of human civilization, the dark side of human nature.
Yeah.
Many of them turned to art, literature, music, to try and express their experiences, to grapple with the trauma they had endured. Authors like Eric Maria Remarque, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, they captured that sense of disillusionment, the loss of faith in progress, the psychological scars that lingered long after the guns fell silent.
So it sounds like the war forced people to confront these darker aspects of humanity,
Yeah.
on a scale never seen before.
And that confrontation had a deep and lasting impact on cultural expression. The art, the literature, the music of the post-war period, it reflects this disillusionment, but also this search for meaning, a reevaluation of societal values.
I'm sensing a theme here, interconnectedness. It's like the war wasn't just about armies clashing on a battlefield.
Right.
It was about this whole web of global forces, economic, political, social, technological, all colliding and reshaping the world.
You've hit the nail on the head. World War I, it wasn't just a war, it was a catalyst.
Right.
For this global transformation that would have repercussions for decades to come.
Okay, so we've talked about how World War I, transformed everything from battlefield tactics to social structures.
Right.
But what about the long-term consequences, like the ripple effects, on the 20th century and even beyond? It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
You're absolutely right. The war's legacy is huge. It's multifaceted. You can't really grasp the 20th century or even our world today without understanding those big shifts that World War I set in motion.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the sources was how the war led to these powerful new ideologies.
Hmm.
Communism, fascism, even more extreme nationalism. It's like the world was suddenly up for grabs, ideologically speaking.
Yeah, the war just shattered the old order. It created this vacuum, and these ideologies rushed in to fill it. Think about it. Millions dead, empires collapsed, economies in ruins.
Right.
People were disillusioned. They were looking for answers. And these ideologies offered, what seemed like simple solutions to these incredibly complex problems.
So it wasn't just about like territories changing hands. It was about whole ways of thinking about the world being challenged and ultimately replaced.
Exactly. Communism, with its promise of social justice and economic equality, it gained a lot of traction after the Russian Revolution.
Right.
For a lot of people, it represented this radical shift away from the capitalist systems that they blamed for the war's devastation.
It must seem like a real alternative, especially for those who had really suffered during the war.
Absolutely. At the same time, in countries like Italy and Germany, which were dealing with the humiliation of defeat and economic hardship,
Mhm.
fascism took hold.
Right.
It appealed to this sense of wounded national pride,
Yeah.
promising a return to greatness through authoritarianism
Yeah.
and a rejection of liberal democracy.
I remember reading in The Impact of the First World War and its implications for Europe about how the Treaty of Versailles, which was, meant to bring peace, it actually ended up fueling resentment and extremism in Germany.
That treaty, though it had good intentions, it ultimately backfired.
Yeah.
The harsh reparations they put on Germany, it crippled their economy and fueled this deep sense of injustice. And that created fertile ground for the rise of Nazi ideology in the decades that followed.
It's a sobering reminder that even attempts to create peace can have unintended consequences.
And it really underlines how important it is to understand history and all its complexity.
Mm.
There are rarely easy answers
Yeah.
or simple solutions
Yeah.
to the challenges we face,
Right.
as individuals and as a global community.
But even with all this turmoil, there were still people who tried to build a more peaceful and cooperative world, right?
Right.
That's where the League of Nations comes in.
Exactly. The League, championed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, it embodied this hope that the lessons of World War I wouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah.
It represented this bold vision for international cooperation,
Yeah.
collective security, peacefully resolving disputes.
It's like humanity, having stared into this abyss of global war, was desperately trying to find a way to prevent another catastrophe like that.
It was ambitious.
Yeah.
And while the League ultimately couldn't prevent World War II, it did lay the groundwork for future international organizations like the
Yeah.
United Nations.
Right.
Its legacy is really about this enduring human desire for a world where dialogue and diplomacy replace violence and war.
And that's a legacy that's just as relevant today as it was a century ago.
More so than ever, perhaps.
Mm.
In a world dealing with these transnational threats like climate change, pandemics, terrorism, the need for global cooperation for understanding is paramount. The lessons of World War I, both its triumphs and its failures, they serve as a guide for us
Yeah.
as we try to navigate the challenges of our own time.
The war also seems to have really impacted how we think about national identity and national security.
The war, while reinforcing the importance of national sovereignty, of self-determination, it also showed how interconnected nations are in a globalized world. It shattered this illusion that countries could just stay isolated from everyone else's conflicts and crises.
So in a way, it forced people to realize that their own security was tied to everyone else's security.
Exactly. And that realization led to a growing awareness of the need for diplomacy,
Mm-hmm.
international cooperation.
Yeah, shared responsibility for global peace and stability.
And that's a concept that's, still evolving today as we deal with issues that go beyond national borders.
Absolutely. The legacy of World War I continues to shape how we think about international relations, global governance, the very nature of conflict and cooperation in the 21st century.
It's mind-boggling to think how one historical event, as horrific as it was, could have such a profound impact,
World War I was a crucible. It was a global trauma that reshaped not just political maps, but the very way we think about war, about peace, about our place in the world. Its echoes, they reverberate through the 20th century and into our present day.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listener to remember about the legacy of World War I?
I'd say this. World War I is both a warning and a source of hope. It's a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked nationalism, militarism, the failure of diplomacy.
But it also shows our capacity for resilience, for innovation, the pursuit of a more just and peaceful world.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of dates and battles, right?
Right.
It's a story of human choices,
Yeah.
of consequences,
Yeah.
and of this constant search for peace and understanding.
And that's what makes history so compelling,
Right.
so relevant to our
Yeah.
lives today. It gives us lessons, insights, perspectives that can uh, help us navigate the complexities of our own time.
This has been incredible. Thank you for guiding us through it all.
It was my pleasure. I hope our listener will keep exploring this fascinating and complex period of history and think about what it means for the world we live in today.
I'm sure they will. And for our listener, remember, this deep dive was just for you. We encourage you to keep exploring this pivotal moment in history, dive deeper into the things that piqued your interest, and consider those lessons from the past as we face the challenges of the present and the future. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.